We're starting a new study today, a new lesson. This one is on Isaiah 2, and it's called Stop Regarding Man. And it's going to be a two-part lesson. We're going to do part this week and then part the next week. And so you aren't going to fully understand this idea of stop regarding man until we get to the second part of it. You're going to see little bits of hints towards that, but you won't get the whole grip of it until then. So don't worry if that doesn't make so much sense right now. But we're going to look a little bit Isaiah first, and then we'll get into this Isaiah 2 prophecy. And Isaiah 2 is kind of a nice prophecy because it's very accessible. It doesn't have a whole lot of symbolism in it, and it's pretty straightforward to understand. So Isaiah, in general terms, um, well, Elijah is the one who's considered to be the greatest of the prophets. We see that in a number of places. He appears with Moses. He's the one prophet who appears with Moses to Jesus at the Transfiguration, and that's Elijah, not Isaiah. But Elijah, during his life, never wrote down any prophecies about the future, about events that would happen. Nothing any more than a few years in his own future. Nothing that goes into our future, or even anything about Jesus. And Isaiah wrote about all of those things. But Isaiah is the prophet who wrote down the most prophecies, and he covered all sorts of areas. And so he's the one that when you see him referred to in Matthew, for example, he is just called the prophet. And everybody knows that's Isaiah because Isaiah is the one who wrote down the most prophets. And so from Matthew, it says, now all this happened that the thing that was spoken from the Lord Yahweh by the prophet would be fulfilled. So you see Matthew just saying the prophet there, and you're supposed to know that that's Isaiah. And so Isaiah's prophecies speak of all sorts of different time periods, events in Isaiah's own time. He talks about things that are coming up in his near future. He talks about Jesus' time. He's kind of the main prophet about Jesus. And he also talks about end time things, and end time things is what we're going to be looking at today in Isaiah 2. So he was covered lots of territory with all of his prophecies. And I've mentioned before this, but I think it's good to review that different prophets had different styles. They would order their prophecies in different ways. Daniel is a prophet who tends to kind of sweep through history. So he will start, for example, with the statue, he would start with Babylonian time periods and then kind of make a long sweep through history right into the end times. And so that was kind of Daniel's style. But Ezekiel is different from that. Ezekiel starts out as being just a bunch of prophecies about his own time and the sins of Israel and what's going to happen to Israel. And other prophets do that part as well. And then once those things happen to Israel that he foretold, then he does a sequence of hops from the tribulation period into the millennium. And so he's kind of different that way, is that his focus changes, and then he starts doing specific stories about things that are going to happen. And I mentioned Ezekiel particularly because we're going to see a lot of Ezekiel in today's lesson. There's going to be quite a bit of overlap between Ezekiel's temple and what we see here. And we'll see that when we get to it, of course. So Isaiah is different from both of those. He just jumps all over the place. For example, chapter 1 of Isaiah is a prophecy about his own time. And then Isaiah 2 that we're going to be looking at is a big jump in time, 4,000 years into the millennial period. And then he'll jump back and maybe he'll do something about Jesus. And he goes back and forth all the time. So there's really no pattern to anything that Isaiah does in his chapters of the prophecies, not like there is with the others. So Isaiah 2 is where our focus is going to be on here. And Isaiah 2 is just the start of a long prophecy that continues on into chapters 3 and 4, but we're only going to cover chapter 2. But chapter 2 it has a lot of meat in it, and I think you'll find that once we go through it, lots of good stuff to understand about that. And in this chapter, Isaiah is speaking about the millennium. He's talking about that 1,000-year period and what life is going to be like during that 1,000 years. And we've seen other prophets talk about that, and Ezekiel was one of those who talked about the temple that would be there at that time. So during this millennial period, if you don't know it already, Jesus is going to be ruling over the earth, and he's doing that to show that there can actually be peace, love, harmony, and justice on the earth. But the only way that that's possible is not with man as king, not as man running their countries. It has to be with God as the king of the whole world, and that's the only way it's going to work. And so it's a demonstration that, in fact, it's possible to have all of these good things, but it's only possible because God is the king of everything. And so therefore it justifies God being king. So this Isaiah 2 prophecy, you'll see as we get into the very first verse of it, it's written to Jerusalem and Judah. And he's doing something that I'll explain a little bit with that. But he's going to be actually referring to all of the world during the millennium. Because Jesus is the king, everybody is going to be under Jesus. So what he says there about the millennium isn't about Jerusalem and Judah. It's just about everybody in that millennial period. And he's going to be describing some aspects of life at that time, how people are going to be, how they're going to think, and how different that's going to be from any time that we've ever seen with humans in control of the world. So, and then once he's kind of described those aspects of life at that time in that perfect society, he's going to apply that to Jerusalem and Judah. He's going to be basically saying, if this is what life should be like, you should be trying to be more like that. And we'll see that when we get to those verses as well. So that's kind of the plan to it. Is he's going to talk about the millennium and what life is going to be like, and then try to convince the Israelites of his time that they should improve themselves based on that as a model. Okay, so he's going to be using prophecy in a purposeful way. He's not just going to be telling us about the millennium for the sake of us learning about the millennium, which would be good enough, but he's actually going to be using it as that tool to instruct Israel on how they should live. And so he's kind of setting up that millennial life as being a standard of goodness, of how people live at that time should be the same way that we try to live our lives at this time. And their attitudes towards life should be the same as well. And so the whole focus, if you were to kind of put a theme on everything here, is an attitude that we don't have a name for. We don't have a name to describe this way of thinking. And there are four different ways that are parts of it. And if you kind of put all four of those together into one attitude, then you would understand that and maybe give it a name. So this attitude is people thinking they are greater than others. And that's a big part of what he's going to cover here is also people thinking others are greater than themselves, and people thinking that they have created great things, and people thinking that others, even mankind generally, have created great things. So all of this idea of one person or the things that a person have created being greater than something else, and mankind being great, all of those ideas are kind of lumped into this attitude that is going to be spoken about here and taught against here. So when it's all covered, at the very end, this prophecy is going to call this idea having regard for man. And that's that first flashback to the title of this, is this idea of not having regard for man. And so once it's kind of titled that and given it a name or a description, it's going to give us some idea of how to get rid of this attitude within ourselves and make sure that we don't have this attitude. So we'll begin looking into Isaiah chapter 2 now, after all those words. And it begins with a very typical opening. Prophets generally start their prophecies with a short description like this. And it says, the word of God came to me, or something like that. And Isaiah here says, the word which Isaiah the son of Amos saw during Judah, concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And as I said, that's very typical of what you see. And it marks the beginning of God's words, which were given to the prophet. So what the prophet is doing, he's going to say in these one sentence introductions, is this is kind of the marker, and everything after this that follows is the prophecy that was given to me by God. And we talked a little bit in the past about how this happened. It appears that God would just dump these prophetic words into their minds, and they would know them as though they had memorized them. And they would write them down, given what they understood or what they had locked into their head. And sometimes they would travel around and give these prophecies out, and they always had them locked in their head that God had dumped them in there. And that's something probably none of us have experienced before. So it's hard to think about. But we see that in all of the other prophets who talk about that, is just suddenly God's word came to them and it was locked in their brains and they were able to write it all down. So as I said before, this prophecy isn't only about Judah and Jerusalem, even though that sort of kind of looks like here. And that's not, it's about the millennium and about applying that to Jerusalem and Judah. And so the message that's in this is for his people. So that's the purpose in this, is he's giving this prophetic vision, or God is giving this prophetic vision in an effort to tell Judah and Jerusalem, this is how you should live. You should be more like the people who live in the millennium. And so one thing that we see there that makes us ask a question is, it looks like Isaiah saw a word, and we need to be careful that to understand that that isn't what it literally says. These prophets were also called seers, a person who sees, and they aren't seeing a word. They are actually struggling for words to describe this. We don't have words to describe the idea that God inserted something into our minds, and all of a sudden we had this 3-chapter prophecy locked in our brain. And so he's working. He's using the words that he has to try and describe what had happened to him. And so this prophecy just came to him. And from this verse on is going to be the prophecy that God gave and dumped into the mind of Isaiah. And it's going to talk about the mountain of the house of the Lord. And this first verse is, or the second verse of the chapter says, "Now it will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills. So the house, the place, the temple of the Lord will be on the mountain." And this is the same temple that Ezekiel was talking about at that time. Remember, we did that lesson on the temple and what it was going to look like and function and what was going to happen there. And so what we're seeing in Isaiah is the same thing. He's going to be talking about that. And so here he says, this mountain where the temple of the Lord is going to be will be the chief of the mountains. And that he means the greatest. But he doesn't mean it as in height, like it isn't going to be taller than Mount Everest. That would be a problem. People wouldn't be able to breathe up there. It'd be cold. They'd freeze to death. And so he doesn't mean it's higher than all of the mountains. He just means it's the greatest of the mountains. And the reason it's the greatest is because God is there. And so don't confuse that as meaning that it's going to be the tallest of all of the mountains. But he does say the mountain will be raised to be above the hills. What hills? Which hills is he talking about there? Well, it's actually a pretty good reason to believe that he's talking about a specific set of hills. This is a picture, a sort of picture of what the land of around Jerusalem was like before Jerusalem was there. And so if we look here, we can see Mount Moriah, and that is where the Temple Mount is right now. That's God's holy hill there. And if you look at that and notice, it is smaller than everything else around it. All the other hills around it are bigger. And those are just the local ones. Off to the side here is the Mount of Olives, and it's actually 350 feet or so above this. And over here, there's another large, on the left, if you don't have Visio, there's another large mountain, you might call it, if you're going to call these hills. And then you can see in the background, there's all these others that are also taller than it. So Mount Moriah is not a big mountain. It's just a hill. And the Bible, as I've mentioned before, calls it God's holy hill. And so it's a small place. But this verse is telling us it's going to be raised above the hills. And so it's going to be at least above all of these hills. And we don't know for sure, but it could also be above these hills, the Mount of Olives and those others. And that would be quite a shocking thing. But we do know that the Mount of Olives here is prophesied that it's going to split, and it's going to move part of it north, which would be away from us, and part of it south, which would be toward us in this picture. So we know that big changes are coming there. And Ezekiel even talks about the battle that's going to come before that split of the Mount of Olives as having a huge earthquake that's going to shake everything and shake mountains down to their core. So we know that there are some coming earthquake events that are going to reshape the land quite a bit. So it's not that hard to believe that this whole Mount Moriah could be raised up and become greater than the hills around us. And that's what the prophecy is indicating to us. And there are other prophecies that give us that same idea too. So what we're seeing here is the use of a word that is appears in lots of other places. And this Hebrew word means lifted up, but it has two different meanings. It can mean to be regarded highly, like a person being regarded highly, or it can mean to physically raise something, to lift something up. And Jesus, for example, used that and kind of confused people because of the way he used that. He talked about, when I am lifted up, then the whole world will look to me. And people thought that he meant, when I am regarded highly, people will come to me. But what he was actually saying, that he was going to be lifted up on a cross and raised up on a cross. And people at first didn't understand that in this time. But and so in this case, I think both meanings are likely true here, that it's going to become the most important in the world, and it's also going to be higher than the hills that currently surround it. So there's going to be both of those things that are true of it. So, and this idea of a small hill becoming a mountain also fits well with a change in the Messiah at that time. Remember when he first came, he was the suffering servant that wouldn't break a reed. He was nothing special, nothing to attract people to. There was nothing magnanimous about him. And so, but now here in the millennium, he has come as the conquering king. And he has changed. He is not that suffering servant that he once was. He's now king of everything. And so that kind of fits well with this idea that the holy hill has now become a mountain and is bigger than the hills around it. So a thought there. So continuing on with the verses, it says, and all the nations will stream to it. And he's talking about this mountain with God's temple on it. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. So we're talking about the millennium here, and these are people streaming to the temple, and we study the temple, and they're streaming there to go up there, and so that God can teach them concerning his ways, and so that they can walk in all of his paths and do right. And that's kind of an interesting thing. We'll talk about that some more. But right now I want to talk about the word stream in there. The Hebrew word that's used there also has two meanings, and the two meanings don't seem to be really related. One meaning is some things that flow together, and the other meaning is to be lightened or to be joyful. And so it comes from a primitive root, which is the word sparkle in Hebrew. And so sparkle could mean to be cheerful, or it could also refer to a running stream, a flow of water. If you've looked at a little stream with the sun in the right direction, the water sparkles because of the movement of the water. And so this sparkling applies here. And so the translation that we get in English is missing this extra connotation to it. It doesn't just mean stream to it, but it means a sparkling stream to it. Joyful people, happy to go up to the mountain of the Lord to learn about his ways, and so that they can walk in his ways and do what is right and live what is right. And that's an interesting idea. It's not an idea that we really see in our life here. It's hard for us to imagine a time when people would be so joyful to learn, to go out and learn God's ways and to live according to them. And you even might wonder, do people even go to church with that attitude now? Do people go to church joyful that they're going to get a chance to learn God's ways, and so that they can put those ways into practice in their own lives? And that should be our attitude. And so that kind of application of that millennial life is what is going to be going on in this prophecy. And we can do this part of it ourselves. We can ask ourselves, what's my attitude when I go to church to learn? Am I there to learn, or am I there to eat cookies and drink coffee? So we can learn from that as well. And the reason this is possible in the millennial period, it certainly isn't possible now, but it's possible in the millennial period because of two things. One is that God is on the throne and he's the king of everything. And the other one is that Satan is locked away and he can't act anymore. And so Revelation 20, verse 3 talks about that. And it says, and he, God, cast him into the abyss and shut and sealed the top of it so that he would not seduce all the nations. So because of the ineffectiveness of Satan now, and because God is on the throne teaching people what is right and wrong, it now becomes possible to be joyful about going to learn God's ways and to apply them into their lives. But we still have to wonder how long such a devotion to God would last. It isn't in the nature of humans within these bodies to think that way. Satan's tempting aside, these bodies still have all sorts of bad desires that we have to master. And we do know what happens at the end of that millennial period. At the end, Satan is released, and he immediately goes into his same mode before of deceiving people. And so they all turn against God again, and there's a big uprising against God. And of course, he shuts that down, and that's the end of everything. So it's not in our nature to be like that, but during the millennium, people will be like that. And it's not just any people. These are people who were not Christians when Jesus returned. Remember that those who were Christians are going to be in different bodies, and we won't be involved in the temple or anything like that. And so these are people who were not believers, people who hated God back then when he returned. And now here they are, joyful to learn his ways. So verse 4 says, for the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations, and he will render decisions for many people. And so these people, as I was talking about, were not Christians. They had no knowledge of God's ways prior to that. They certainly didn't live in God's ways. And now they need to learn how to live according to his law. So there's going to be a big movement. All these people are going to need to learn how to live as they should live. And also as individuals, of course, and we understand that because we do that ourselves, but also as nations. And this is something that's never happened before. We've never had multiple nations trying to live according to God's ways. But that's something that'll be different in the millennium too, is that God will be the king over all of these nations, and these nations will not be fighting with each other anymore. He will render decisions between them whenever there's disputes. So everything that was necessary before and not done before is now going to be done, and there's going to be harmony between all of the nations. And so that's going to be the next topic that Isaiah addresses, is this harmony between the nations. And this is going to be a verse that you've seen many times before, this swords into plowshares verse. And so this is verse 4. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. And I've talked about how different this millennial world will be different from our world now, and it's almost unimaginable. Here, all of the militaries of the world will be disbanded. There's simply no need for them anymore. God will be the judge, and when they have disputes between one nation and another nation, God will be there to iron it out and make sure that everybody is happy with the solution. And so when the militaries of the world are disbanded and there's no longer any war, all of the deaths and expenses of those will no longer be incurred in our societies. So we have more money that we can do good things with. The members of those militaries will also become productive in society rather than members that are of a necessity there to protect society. And so it's hard, as I said, to imagine the huge shift in society that results from that. And I won't talk about all the other changes that go along with that, but just that one would be a very large change. And so now, with this description of the millennium in place, Isaiah is going to change, and he's going to start talking to the people of his time and telling them that's how it's going to be in the millennium. You should be walking in the light of the Lord in the same way that they are, and having that same attitude of wanting to walk in the light of the Lord. So verse 5 says, "Come, house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. For you have abandoned your people," and I was talking about you, God, have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob, because they are filled with influences from the east, and they are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they strike bargains with the children of foreigners. So right there, he's saying, you aren't like the millennial people because you do these particular things. And he lists a few of them here. He's going to list more later on. And so he wants them to be like that sparkling stream of people who are going up to the millennial temple, but they aren't like that. He says, God has turned away from you because you've adopted a whole bunch of bad teachings from outside. And we know that within the Christian churches now, we have the same problem. The Roman Catholic Church is especially bad that way, is that it has adopted all sorts of foreign teachings from other religions and other places, and now teaches them as though they're part of Christianity. And that's a natural thing. Those influences do tend to come in if there's no one there to drive them back out. And he says of the Israelites of his time that they are also involved in divination or sorcery and similar practices like that. And we don't know exactly what they were doing like that, but that's something that is also partly in the Christian churches. There are people who do those sorts of things, are involved in those sorts of things. He also says of the Israelites that they are unequally yoked with foreigners. He doesn't say those words exactly, but that's what he means. He says literally, you strike bargains with the children of foreigners. And they weren't supposed to have that kind of relationship with unbelievers. You aren't supposed to be bound together in a relationship like that. And that's true of us as unbelievers. We shouldn't, or as believers, we shouldn't be bound to unbelievers in those kind of agreements, because those don't work for us. The unbelievers are going to be driving us around according to their tune if they get a chance. And so it's a bad relationship to bind an unbeliever together with a believer. So he continues on talking about the ways that Israel is different from the millennial people. And he says, Their land has also been filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land has also been filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. So he's talking about specific things here. Again, basically he's saying you've accumulated wealth as though it could save you from something, but it can't save you from anything. God has turned away from you, and you're in trouble. Um, and so one of the things that he talks about is silver and gold, which was the money of that time. And accumulation of wealth of any kind is likewise a problem for many people in the church here. Um, and he talks about other treasures, doesn't mention them, but he says all of these treasures, your heart is chasing after these things, and you've been piling them up as though they could do you some good, but they won't. And he talks about horses. Now, horses, you probably don't understand the reference there, but Israel was actually commanded not to have horses. They're supposed to be on donkeys and other things than horses. And so that's the reference there, is that they've been bringing a whole bunch of horses in. What the Israelites really needed was oxen to plow fields, and they needed donkeys for other things to carry loads, but they weren't to have horses. And also chariots. Chariots were kind of a sign of wealth, and also they tended to be involved in military operations a lot. And so they would be like the cars and trucks of our time, or the military vehicles also. And so he says, you have no end of these things. You think that you're going to be protected by these things. You think you're wealthy. These things have no value in you. And we know how things do end up for Israel. God eventually does take them down at the hands of the Babylonians. And all of their wealth and chariots and horses and all that sort of stuff goes for naught. Now he's going to kind of summarize all of these things up into the idea of worshiping the work of your hands, their hands. And in verse 8, he gets to that idea. He says, their land has also been filled with idols. They worship the work of their hands, that which their fingers have made. And he's not just talking about images of gods. And Israel was doing some of that at that time. They were making gods out of silver and gold and wood and other things. And God was on their case about that. But they were worshiping other things that they could also create. And they were desiring those things, revering those things, consulting them for information, glorifying them as though they were something that could be glorious. And we don't know exactly what they were doing, but we know that there are so many other things that we ourselves can come to worship. And it can happen so subtly that we don't even see it happening sometimes. And something as simple as a hammer I often use as an example here. And so when does a hammer, a common work tool, become an idol? Well, it can become an idol. And it becomes an idol when you think that that hammer is the source of protection or wealth or something that it can do for you, and not just a tool that you use to pound a nail into a board. And so we can have the wrong idea about things and put them in a wrong place inside of ourselves. So it's not that there's something wrong with the hammer, it's our relation to it, the way that we think about the hammer. And of course, a hammer is a pretty simple tool, but there are lots of other things in our lives. And I often wonder about smartphones and the cell phones and things like that, Game Boy toys that we have in our lives, all of the computers and other things. Are these just tools for us, or are some of these things taking up a big part of our life? And are they starting to push God out of our lives and pushing him aside to make room for these other things that are teaching us stuff, or maybe they're glorious things, they're amazing things, yes, indeed, but we shouldn't have that attitude towards them. And so we, in our time, can have a lot of these problems with worshiping the work of our hands and not realizing what we're getting into. And so now he gets to a big idea here, and that's going to be the idea of being humbled. And he's now talking again. He was talking to the Israelites. Now he's going to start talking to about the millennial people and the millennial time. And so he talks about those people saying, so the common man has been humbled, and the man of importance has been abased. Abased means reduced, made smaller. So he's talking about humbling generally all those people. And not just the important people. You might think that, sure, the great men, the people who think that they're great or that other people think they're great, those are the people who need to be humbled. But in fact, even the common man, he says, needs to be humbled. So those of us who are nothing on the world stage, we aren't big people, we aren't big entertainers, we aren't politicians, we aren't anything like that. But even us, we can have attitudes in us that require us to be humbled. And that is what happens in the millennial period. All of those people have been humbled. And we'll see more about how that happens in next week's lesson, really. But this idea of being humble is really a key concept, and maybe a lesson that I'll bring up again sometime. Um, it is foundational in our relationship with God to be humble. And we sometimes think we're humble when we don't realize that we aren't that humble. It's the nature of mankind to start to think that you're something, that you've achieved something, you've done something yourself, and that you are somehow glorious and special because you achieved something. That's really a wrong attitude. And during the millennial period, God is going to make it very clear to people that He is way up here and all the rest of us are way down here with very little difference between us. And so this humbling is going to be a big step in the millennial period, a first step when people learn that they need to be humble. And so I'm going to talk about the very last part of that verse. I didn't talk about it on the last slide, but the very last part of that verse ends up with the words, but do not forgive them. So he's talking about humbling them and even the lofty ones, the ones who think that they're special, humbling them. And here he says, but do not forgive them. And this takes us back to something we studied when we looked at Ezekiel's temple in the millennial period. And that is the idea of why are those sacrifices going on? What's happening there? And how is salvation possible, or is it even possible? And so what we see here is a specific indication that forgiveness is not available in that time. And, and maybe there is some way, we don't know anything about that, but we know that the sacrifice of Jesus no longer applies in that millennial period. So there isn't that atonement that is in place now. That won't be in place at that time. And so if there's some sort of method of forgiveness or restoration, we don't know or don't know how that would work. So it looks like there isn't a way to be forgiven, to be put in a right restoration with God at that time. And so we see something that's kind of interesting when we think about that. We see that these people who are sparkling, joyful people walking up to the temple, talking about how they're anxious to go up there and to learn from God and to apply those things to their lives, are doing this apparently without any promise of forgiveness. And they're doing it only because they know that is the right way to live. That is how they should live their lives. And that should be the same for us too. We shouldn't be Christians because we hope to get something out of it. We should be Christians because that's the right way to live. And it should be obvious to us that this is a better way to live. We shouldn't find ourselves in a situation where we say, oh, I don't want to do that. We should always find ourselves in a situation of we know that the ways of God are the right way to live, and that living that kind of a life is just a better way to live, and it results in all sorts of benefits to the way you live. So that's the first chapter of this. We'll continue on next week with the last part of this. And we'll get into a lot of interesting things there. We're going to talk about something called chiasms. I've mentioned those before because Isaiah 2 has a couple of those going on. And we'll learn more about this idea of stopping regarding man, stopping valuing some people better or less than others, and also valuing the works of our hands better or less. And so all of those things we'll cover next week.